Three. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here at this April issue of the 2025 RSVP Digi Events, which is a really popular online format which we hold around every month. And we're delighted to see people who are long-term members of RSVP as well as newbies as well. You're all very welcome. I'm Alison Chapman. I'm Professor of English at the University of Victoria in sunny BC this morning. It's a beautiful spring day. And I'm also Vice President of RSVP, and it is one of my duties and pleasures to run the Digi Event series. And I'm really happy to see you all here. Just a quick reminder of the format before I introduce our speaker. These Digi Event formats, the speaker will talk for about 20 minutes, and that will leave plenty of time for discussion and comments and questions. After the speaker's finished talking, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll try to get to everybody if there's time. You're also very welcome to put comments and questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring that along with Corey Newman, who is my wing person for Digi Events. So thank you very much. All right, it's my great pleasure to welcome Paul Fyfe and fresh news. Paul is, in the last 2 days, appointed as full professor at North Carolina State University. Many congratulations, Paul. Richly deserved. I'm really pleased for you. And Paul is also director of the Graduate Certificate in Digital Humanities. Paul will be introducing his latest book entitled Digital Victorians Today. This work was supported by the American Council of Learned Societies and a fellowship at the National Humanities Center with the help of a field development grant from RSVP, not government funded. Shall I underline that? RSVP has its own money. And Paul is working with an international team on using multimodal AI on 19th century illustrated newspapers. He's also co-PI on North Carolina State Center for AI in Society and Ethics, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, except, as Paul writes here, that grant, along with so many other NEH awards, was rescinded earlier this week by DOGE. And I know I speak for everybody here when I send my solidarity and support to you and everybody else who was affected by the cuts. Paul is, of course, really well known to RSVP, and we're greatly looking forward to his talk, which is a book launch party for digital Victorians. All right, over to you, Paul.
Thanks, and thanks everybody. It's kind of a dour time, but just seeing all of your presence here does make it feel more celebratory. I wanted in that bio to really underscore the kind of institutional support for the scholarship that I've been able to do for reasons that will become clear in the talk today. So I'm going to start with a brief overview of this book. In the broadest sense, Digital Victorians essentially combines my two major preoccupations as a scholar. British Victorian literature on the one hand, digital humanities on the other. The book tries to make a connection between them, tracing the roots of DH well before computers and finding them instead within the 19th century media landscape. Now, that includes some notable changes in telecommunications infrastructure and technologies, including the railway, steamships, industrialization of printing, the mass image, telegraphy, photography, phonography, radio, etc. However, as we know, technological inventions are never the whole story. What I got interested in was how they made people feel and how they felt like they were living through an unprecedented era. Because that was how I felt in my 20s. In college, getting a Telnet email for the first time in a Netscape browser. Then getting a job at a .com in New York City. Then getting laid off from that .com. Then going to grad school, during which time the very term digital humanities was named. It all seemed like a new technological era. However, because I was also studying 19th century British literature, including with certain people here, I couldn't help noticing that this sense of a media revolution had happened before. And perhaps we had inherited older ways of thinking about it, even if our digital changes seemed dramatically new. For example, in a contemporary book called Rethinking Media Change, the editors use a famous quotation from John Stuart Mill from his essay, The Spirit of the Age, to introduce their own preoccupations with digital media. In 1831, Mill writes, "The first of the leading peculiarities of the present age is that it is an age of transition." In 2003, the editors write, quote, "Set aside the 19th century tonalities, and this passage could belong to our own era. Its apocalyptic rhetoric and its self-conscious awareness of change closely mirror the discourse of the so-called digital revolution." But we can't just set aside that influence. The very ways we conceptualize new media have pre-computational histories, many of which can be found in 19th century reactions to their emerging media. Alan Liu calls this the new media encounter, a discursive moment in which new media gets theorized in contrast to what came before. I also use Mill's quote as an epigraph, as well as a different quote from Liu's essay about the new media encounter. New media are old, and old media are new. In other words, this road runs both ways. We have inherited digital concepts from the Victorians, new media are old, and we can use digital concepts to look differently at Victorian texts and concepts. Old media are new. And I use this structuring anachronism or strategic presentism throughout the book. Ultimately, the digital and the Victorian mutually inform each other. This is from the introduction. Looking back, the history of the digital present extends to 19th century encounters with media in transition. Looking forward, this history reframes our own contemporary relationships with the digital, especially in context of the materials, interpretive practices, and professional landscape of the humanities. So the book tries to offer what Lisa Gittleman has called a pre-digital history of the digital humanities, pushing its context and emergence further back before computers. It argues how DH and new media have been shaped not in the present, but very much in the context of what came before. Here, just a capsule shot of what I hope are some of the book's contributions. First, an overall history of the new media encounter from Victorian print and telecommunications technologies to the digital present. Each chapter tries to offer genealogies for what I think are durable Victorian concepts. These include the sense of digital immateriality in chapter 1, in which I look especially at Thomas de Quincey, at newspapers, and at illustrated periodicals. A sense of network surveillance and permanent memory in chapter 2, which thinks about George Eliot and data ethics. The emergence of quantitative analysis and machine reading in chapter 3, which is mostly me hate reading Henry James. In chapter 4, the monstrous threats of digital researchers, in which I use the long history of Jekyll and Hyde and adaptations from audiobooks to arguments at MLA. And finally, in chapter 5, the creation of archives and formation of disciplines, including DH and Victorian studies as such. I'm going to share a look at that last one today. This comes from towards the end of chapter 5 in the book, which tells the story of how 19th century newspapers even became digital resources and why that history matters. Some of you may know some of this material as an initial version was first published in Victorian Periodicals Review. The chapter expands on that work substantially and ends with a news section where I argue that the digitization of Victorian periodicals may give us a shadow history of Victorian studies itself. So the title of this talk, The Victorian Periodical Frame of Mind, refers to Walter Houghton's book, The Victorian Frame of Mind, published in 1957, the same year as the inaugural issue of the journal Victorian Studies. Also that same year, the Times Literary Supplement actually published a review of that first issue of Victorian Studies, judging, quote, its enterprise at least as novel as that which has set a man-made moon revolving about the face of the earth. And they're talking about the Sputnik satellite, making equivalents of the launch of Victorian Studies and the space age, which had shockingly appeared in the sky the previous month. So because of this, it's kind of conventional to take 1957 as the birthday for Victorian Studies as a field. But I want to offer a different origin study for Victorian Studies, shifting the focus from high-profile launches, books, journals, satellites, to the low-profile development of its scholarly infrastructure. This story seeks to recover the work of bibliographers, list makers, librarians, and uncelebrated knowledge workers who envision and support the archives of a field. And it puts the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals at the very center of that work. The first issue of Victorian Studies in 1957 begins with this brief prefatory note. It emphasizes, quote, openness to critical and scholarly studies from all the relevant disciplines, distinguishing this new field by its broad approach. However, Michael Wolff, one of the founding editors of the journal and co-author of this opening proclamation, would soon become convinced that the field's broad approach was not broad enough. Within a decade, Wolff proposed that new sources of research material were needed, and that Victorian periodicals were just what was required. By the late 1960s, Wolff and others had envisioned a standalone journal and a separate scholarly society, which became in 1968 the mimeographed Victorian Periodicals Newsletter, or VPN, later, of course, Victorian Periodicals Review, and in 1969, the Research Society of Victorian Periodicals. From the start, Victorian Studies foregrounded its historical focus and its interdisciplinary methods. But behind the scenes, Wolff's other scholarly enterprises were resolutely bibliographical. As he declared, quote, I should be delighted to have the Victorian Studies Office used as a clearinghouse for news of bibliographical projects underway and of acquisitions in book and microform, unrecorded in the Union catalogs, for offers of moral or substantive support, and for practical suggestions. Wolff would soon make such a proposal in a well-known article called Charting the Golden Stream, Thoughts on a Directory of Victorian Periodicals, which would eventually evolve into the Wellesley Index. It opened with a page-long quotation from Cornelius Walford, a late 19th century bibliographer who embarked on a voluminous dictionary of all newspapers and periodicals in England. As Jim Mussel shows in his excellent work on periodical indexing, Walford's Dictionary of Periodical Literature was one of just several such encyclopedic bibliographies envisioned at the time. The frenzy for periodical indexes that Mussel finds in the 1880s seems to recur again in the 1960s, as if there's a second wave of bibliographic ambition, or utopianism, for the archive of Victorian print. But why? I strongly suspect this has less to do with what Wolff saw as the intellectual resources of 19th century print, and more to do with the emerging possibilities of 20th century tools of information management, including micropublishing and computerization, as well as the social reorganization of scholarly labor around these new technologies of reference. Ultimately, Victorian studies may owe less to grand claims about its broad interdisciplinarity than to the everyday labor of making lists of its texts. So, periodical studies only represents part of that field, but it does bring into sharp focus the dynamics among academic societies, the tools of information management, and the reorganization of scholarly labor that together give a clearer picture of disciplinary formation. From its very inception, RSVP entwines with the emerging mediums that would regenerate its archives. The first issue of VPN appeared in 1968, the first national meeting of yet unnamed Victorian periodical scholars in 1969. As Rosemary Van Arsdell recounts, quote, "The program opened with a discussion of a totally new technology in periodicals research, microfilm. Even more important, however, was an announcement of the formation of RSVP." But that word, however, is misleading. The formation of RSVP doesn't contrast with the new technology of microfilm, but emerges precisely in relation. Merrill Distad noted something else about that first conference. Quote, "The opening session, appropriately, consisted of a presentation by Michael Barnett of Columbia University's Library School on the use of computers in periodical research." Note that word, appropriately. Such potential uses of computers in microform preoccupied many of RSVP's early members. As reported in the subsequent issue of VPN, quote, "Two of the most important projects announced at this meeting were James E. O'Neill's effort to list newspapers and periodicals available on microfilm, and Dorothy Deering's pioneering computer program for indexing the Victorian press." In RSVP's mission statements, Wolfe and others would continue to emphasize the, quote, "sheer intellectual value of periodicals as windows into the literary and journalistic culture of the Victorian age." This appeared in Victorian Studies in 1970, the RSVP Manifesto, published by Wolfe and Joel Wiener, in which they claimed that journalism was the distinctive forum for British Victorian writers, and that periodicals offered a vast, relatively unknown, and uncharted resource for academics. Much of RSVP's usual business was helping to envision and build an infrastructure for the systematic study of these authors and texts. Patrick Leary has shown how Wolfe, Houghton, and Richard Altick all envisioned such projects in the 1950s, linking their large ideas for the field to the catalogs they made. According to Christopher Ricks, who reviewed the Wellesley Index on its first publication, quote, "It will quietly change the whole nature of Victorian studies." But even quieter changes were taking place in the background of such high-profile projects, as periodical scholars reckoned with the implications of newer technologies for list making and information retrieval. Notably, Wolfe and Houghton each envisioned their index as a card catalog, the same technique as their Victorian predecessors. While Wolfe continually emphasized the scale of 19th century journalism, others were reckoning with the possibilities of 20th century information management. This is the masthead of the first issue of the Victorian Periodicals newsletter, which credits Wolfe as editor and Dorothy Deering as associate editor. At that time, Deering was a PhD student at Indiana University and Wolfe's research assistant. Deering had already circulated an initial form letter to Victorian Studies subscribers, soliciting subscriptions for its new periodical offshoot, or VPN. But Deering was also pioneering how the field's nascent bibliographical projects might be adapted to and expanded by computers. As Hans de Groot explains, the Wellesley Index must have been one of the last scholarly projects of its kind put together without the help of a computer. But Deering understood that, quote, "the new digital capabilities of preserving and making periodicals accessible are the next step in accessing the golden stream that Michael Wolfe originally envisioned." Deering began to explore the capacities of computer punch cards with limited storage, yet capable of extraordinary cross-referencing at scale, and wrestling with hard questions. What data even to describe? How to control for the shifting nature of titles, editors, frequency, and runs in periodicals, and how the inevitable gaps within a computerized collection affected its representativeness. All of these problems continue to define digital scholarship on the Victorian press. Deering's efforts also show how academic labor was expanding to agents outside the usual historiography of this field, big-name scholars with their large ideas. As Deering reported about the Victorian Periodicals Project in 1970, quote, "The pilot computer study was made possible through the facilities of the Indiana Research Computing Center and the help of Mary Ann Shaw, programmer. I am particularly indebted to the generous assistance of Susan Gleiserman, editorial assistant of Victorian Studies, who gave much of her time to seeing the program through its early stages." Scholars in feminist science and technology studies, or STS, have noted how women disappear in the history of computing, even while establishing its foundations and performing so much of its labor. But these women were instrumental in the digital transformation of Victorian periodicals research from its inception. Also notable in this case is Deering's involvement with the early infrastructure for humanities computing, first working with a mainframe at Indiana's Research Computing Center, and then on taking a lectureship at Purdue with its generous budget for computing in the humanities. Additionally, Deering found grant support from the Chapelbrook Foundation of Boston and the Council on Library Resources. Such alliances would shape Victorian periodicals research and national funding bodies in tandem. In the 20th century, post-war funding for humanities research also took cues from scholarship in 19th century periodicals. Russell Weiland, who may or may not still be a deputy director at the National Endowment for the Humanities, has made a compelling argument that, quote, "the same forces that gave rise to Victorian studies had their equivalent on Capitol Hill with the passage of the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act of 1965. Victorian studies and periodicals research flourished with post-war investments in interdisciplinary and area studies in U.S. universities. According to Weiland, Victorian studies had good timing, articulating the importance of its subject and the necessity of interdisciplinary methods at the very moment the humanities benefited from justifications of its public interest. Furthermore, periodical studies was defining a series of bibliographic projects ready-made for funding by the newly formed NEH. This is Weiland. If Victorian studies functioned independently to prepare scholars with the rhetoric and arguments that would articulate the very goals set out by Congress for the NEH, then the chatty Victorian Periodicals newsletter and its entrepreneurial editor, Michael Wolff, served as the mouthpiece for the kinds of funding needed for Victorian studies immediately after NEH opened its doors. So Weiland spotlights Wolff's entrepreneurialism and later Houghton's grand enterprise as signature examples of this, though he also acknowledges the more workaday contributions within the early issues of VPN. But I think even more credit is due to the various correspondents in VPN's proposals and reports, not only for the lists, indexes, and resources they proposed, but for their imaginative engagement with then new mediums. If Victorian studies and national funding bodies were mutually constitutive, as Weiland suggests, they also took shape in the context of technologies that redefined what archivist Ernest Taubes, writing in 1958, called the age of record keeping. Wolff imagined periodical scholars as heir to Cornelius Walford, but contemporary scholars may owe more to Deering. She envisioned historical materials less as a surging river to heroically explore than as a network emerging from the conditions of Victorian print media. And she understood this, I strongly suspect, as computerization moved the age of record keeping, art catalogs, microfilm, toward an age of information storage and retrieval. In other words, her view of the past shifts towards what present-day technologies were disclosing about it, increasingly defined by databases and the networks they constructed and revealed. As she explained, quote, increased knowledge about any one periodical or publisher or writer for a periodical inevitably sheds light on others in the vast and endlessly interlocking world of Victorian journalism. Furthermore, Deering's legacy follows another stream toward the collaborative labors and grant support for the digital humanities. New tools require the social reorganization of academic labor, from Deering's time in humanities computing to the institution of DH as such. I think Deering's ancestors include scholars like Laurel Brake, among the directors of the 19th Century Serials edition. Brake would expand Deering's insights, urging scholars to move away from individual biographies or authors, which was the organizing kernel of the Wellesley Index, and toward understanding periodical networks. As Brake pointed out, computerization reveals in retrospect that, quote, networking can be understood as part of the structure of journalism. Importantly, Brake also urged an expansive view of networks, expanding its agents beyond authors to include, quote, the material characteristics of the media that constitute those networks, especially in context of digitization. In other words, our intellectual histories cannot be separated from the material infrastructure for how periodicals were collected, remediated, and accessed. Nor, would I add, can those material histories be separated from the social and scholarly reorganization they occasion, in which researchers continue to practice. Okay, this can't be the whole story, and I admit I'm a little sorry to mess up Victorian Studies' birthday. But perhaps at least it offers a corrective in which the everyday labors, infrastructure, and material histories of a field are as constitutive as the grand claims it makes. It also spotlights how Victorian periodicals have always been on the forefront of new media in terms of how they were produced in the 19th century and reproduced throughout the 20th and 21st. We are assembled at one of RSVP's digital events, but perhaps RSVP, if you believe this talk, has been a digital event since its formative and earliest days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Totally fascinating, riveting, resonant. What an amazing model of history you're offering as well, with this complex interweaving of labor, disciplinary formation, media history. I'm really in awe of that. Thank you so much. And to think of the humble Digi event as structurally important in the history of Victorian studies too is really fascinating. Thank you. I'm going to stop talking now because there must be many questions. And I'm wondering if anybody would like to kick off with something. If you want to put your hand up or put a question in the chat, I'd be delighted to hear from you. Patrick.
Hi. And Paul, wonderful book, and I've enjoyed it so much, learned so much from it. It's just, I like to think of it starting a whole series of conversations about all these issues. Really interesting. I have a bone to pick, though, about it, and I just thought I would mention it. Michael Wolff had nothing to do with the origins of the Wellesley Index. I mean, absolutely nothing. This was cooked up by Houghton on his own in consultation with Richard Altick. Charting the Golden Stream comes out in 1971. The Wellesley Index was already named and had a board of editors and was in progress in 1956. It had already published its first volume in 66. It was well underway, and in fact, Michael Wolff had worked with it for a time and then had to be basically asked to leave because he wasn't doing any work. So this is all in my article about Houghton and Altick that was in the VPR a few years back. What I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding here about what project that he and Deering were talking about. When they were talking about the Victorian Periodicals Project, they weren't talking about the Wellesley Index. They were talking about the Waterloo Directory. which as you know, a completely different thing under the supervision of John North uh, up at University of Waterloo. And in fact, John, you would love talking to John. He's in his 90s now, but I'd love to see you bring your expertise on this to his experience with Dorothy Deering, because Dorothy Deering he told me, this whole bulging suitcase of punch cards with her to Waterloo for a meeting about how can we use computers to get this periodicals directory off the ground. And he has a whole story about that. In practice, he wound up having to, what she brought didn't turn out to be useful, and he had to start from scratch. But so the Waterloo directory gets left out of a lot of these discussions because it was separate from RSVP. Um, John went off on his own and did all this, and it's a magnificent resource, but it has evolved in a kind of a separate line from the inner circle of RSVP that included people who were involved with the Wellesley. So anyway, with that
Yes.
exception, so forgive me, I didn't mean to, make a correction, but I just think it's important to get this part of the history right.
I appreciate that. I regret that both of these projects begin with W, because that is the error in retrospect, realize crept into the book. I've corrected it in a version of this that will appear in a special issue of Victoriographies this summer. That comes out of NAVSA's event, special issue co-edited by Dina Faluga and Josh King and Baylor. But what I also appreciate, Patrick, is your detailed understanding of that historiography, and your piece is so useful at and inspiring at looking back to those formative histories and how these resources that we use are kind of imprinted with the stories and assumptions of how they were made. I agree that it is important to be particular about that. And I think what I'm also trying to do is sort of gesture towards a trend, right, in which all these folks were kind of participating in a moment in these decades of what I think is the second wave of bibliographic ambition that we also see in the last decades of the 19th century. And that, as your article points out, there are various ways that kind of takes shape. And I think what I'm trying to do is to link those, or to try and risk a more like technologically deterministic argument about them, to do a kind of media archaeology, but also not lose sight of the labor involved. I have tried to reach out to Professor Deering without success, and I'm not sure if she's still around. If so, quite old. But these kind of histories can be very hard to access. The piece on the archaeology of Victorian newspapers, which is also the kernel of that chapter, makes this point that oftentimes we get these digital resources on which we depend and which shape the historiography of our work without it having preserved the decisions and potentially infighting and problems and assumptions that that largely condition what we can do with it. And I think actually RSVP has been quite good at taking occasions to reflect on its own institutional history. There's been a sequence of moments where VP and VPR have published retrospectives from folks And I hope that really continues because they've been invaluable. And early issues of VPN are worth looking at themselves. They are absolutely wild. And you can kind of see how like why would that be important? Like someone is like, hey, here's a list of 453 editors. And that's your publication, right? It's like it's amazing, and kind of funny, and very different from thinking about like what are the landmark pieces of scholarship that we identify in the past.
This conversation, if I can just interject, it just reminds me also of the importance of personal testimony, as well as accessing a rich and complex history of the discipline. So thank you, Patrick, for making that kind of intervention. But I also noticed that Ian Crawford had a fascinating point in the chat too about accessibility of these, the indices, in particular, the Waterloo. The Wellesley also can be difficult to access when it gets amalgamated with a larger database. And that's kind of part of the issue as well. If I can jump in and ask a completely different kind of question, I'm really fascinated by the ways in which anachronism is sort of structuring your understanding of literary history. But I'm also particularly interested in your work on scale too, both in Digital Victorians and in your lovely shorter article on scale as part of the keyword series for Victorian literature and culture, I think it is. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how anachronism and scale and literary history might work together. Maybe and invite you to talk about this in relation to the fascinating book cover of Digital Victorians.
Okay. So we'll start with anachronism, which is, I think, been a real interesting dimension of methodological discussions in Victorian studies of the last 10 years or more, especially as articulated by the V21 collective as a sort of first as a way of energizing Victorian studies and kind of urging them, if not arming them, to intervene in urgent conversations about the present. They define this as strategic presentism, and I see myself, sort of in that camp. For me, the intervention is in how new media even understands itself as new, and scholars have a lot of problems with that term. Like new media has been declaring itself new forever, and the term in some ways becomes useless, taken at face value, and that's where that kind of historical comparative perspective is more useful. It's like when does newness continually come up? And I think we are again in that moment of seeing new media claim innovations and disruptions and unprecedented things in complete disregard of its consequences in the present. But also its kind of longer history that's really important to determine. In terms of scale, I think many periodical scholars are swimming in these waters from the get-go, right? That the story of Victorian periodicals in some way is the story about of scaling up, of print into a mass phenomenon, especially in concert with its industrialization. That's not the whole story, obviously, and there are really important counter arguments about slow print, as Elizabeth Miller calls it, and unstamped press, and even coterie networks, etc. However, that has also fascinated me as another source for this sense of disorientation that was felt then and that we're feeling again now, right? That there is just too many things. This has been formalized also in the present in digital humanities in a way of that computers not only allow us to increase the availability of our resources, but give us tools for analysis at that scale. So even if you have access to millions and millions of pages, what are you going to do about it as a reader? Well, maybe you need methods. And that's, I think, very much what has interested me as a digital humanities scholar, for whom Victorian 19th century periodicals is a natural source of experiment and opportunity, which we messed around with the Oceanic Exchanges Project and other internally funded things to try computer vision techniques, and now RSVP's grant for Thomas Smith's to lead, which I'm on, that tries to experiment with multimodal AI to deal with the difficulties of sprawling collections of digitized images that don't have kind of searchability. So I think scale is an example of this kind of anachronistic resonance. The book cover, that's a different story. I'll just share that again. This image actually is AI generated. When the press asked me what kind of pictures do you want to put on your book, I, offered them some examples of books that I thought were cool and some different kind of images, including one that I remember from being a grad student. I saw a conference poster, and I'm going to risk trying to find it in real time here, that was then photoshopped of Victoria talking on a cell phone. And I loved that, right, for its playfulness, its perversity, and really kind of forcing an issue of this kind of comparison of past and present. I can't find it in real time. But so I also teach here at North Carolina State classes in data and society, many of which have a kind of humanistic lean or an ethical emphasis. And so I took my class to our libraries where they have terminals that have subscriptions to AI generating software called Midjourney. And we work through them. We talk about the really notable problematics that get involved in generating images, where those images come from, what kind of presumptions they make, what kind of biases they encode, and then students play. So this is all in the service of creating a kind of critical data literacy or AI literacy in the students. And I made this for, just to see if I could recreate that. The press liked it, asked if we could use it. I was like, this is going to get me canceled. Are you sure? This is taking no labor, no jobs. Your art department is fine. And they were like, we think it is a kind of interesting and provocative statement. And I agree. Unfortunately, that's like the last thing that you add to the book, so I didn't get to include any notes about it or write about it within it. But I do think it is another kind of gesture towards a prehistory or a anachronistic correspondence that we're also called to think about. And there are various scholars that I admire who are like doing this kind of thinking about Victorian AI or what Victorianists can add to that conversation, which may be the next project. But we will see.
Thank you so much for that response. It's really fascinating. Any more questions or comments from the audience? I see Chip has his real hand up. Chip, please go ahead.
Hi, I must be the least RSVP-oriented scholar in the room, but I want to ask a question about literary history, or indeed history as such, which follows on the very interesting category of the anachronism. I think of network and its synonym system really, if I confess, two-dimensionally and at most three-dimensionally as occurring in space. And thus, the temporality of the network is, for me, reflexively the present. History, I think of as on a transverse dimension to that, as narrative, or of time as a fourth dimension, if that idea has any currency or interest. What does the predominance of network, as you're using it, both to describe the relations of editors, intellectuals, magazines, and institutions in the 19th century, and all the stuff you were just showing to us about how Victorian studies got involved in networking in a kind of piggybacking or self-reinforcing loop of technology and persons and all the rest. Do you think of network and history in the same thought, Paul? What happens if we think of a network as encompassing the fourth dimension of time? How does that change the way we think about the relationship between the past and the present, if at all?
Thank you, Chip. I think you're right to suggest that network has its own kind of presentist bias in flattening history into a picture of connections that lose that dimension.
Franco Moretti, for example, and all the
Sure.
diagrams and systems, yeah.
And there may be, as you also suggest, kinship with other models we have to talk about affiliations over time, for which certain folks here have published, like generations, for example. We could imagine as a kind of temporal network, genealogies stretched across, even networks that are kind of located or broadly in space. And I think about Mary Shannon's really excellent work about this is what's happening in this place at this time, and it matters who lives at what address, right? Which is fascinating. But there's also other kind of objects that I think we're more used to analyzing, like genre, right? As this cluster of affiliations that is rough at its edges and that unfolds differently across time. I think what's interesting about all of these is that they're, if not mass events, at least like collectives that you have to analyze beyond the single example, and which may lend themselves to analysis at scale, which is one of the reasons why network analysis was so prominent in early digital humanities projects, as efforts to model genre continue to be, as scholars adapt to machine learning techniques. Ted Underwood is working with language models at the moment to sort of try and reimagine literary history as kind of dependent on these clusters and connections. What happens if you run literary history forward but take out Walter Scott, right? Like, what do you get? Like, can you identify the significance of those changes? So I think your question is unanswerable and a provocation in that, like, what are the models that we use, and do we have the right models to talk about these like meaningful clusters of relations in the dimensions that are important to us?
Thank you both. And I see that Martin Hewitt has his hand up. Martin, feel free to jump in. Good to see you.
Hi, and hopefully you can both see and now hear me. Yep, hi everyone. Paul, thanks, that's fantastic. I must confess I haven't yet read your book, so my apologies for that. And therefore my question might be, kind of by the by at one sense. And I'm also aware that it might seem a little kind of naive. But I'm really fascinated by the kinds of characteristics that you're exploring. So you've talked a lot of rightly about scale and about networks and obviously about the materiality of media. And I just wondered if you might want to reflect on two other things, which I think perhaps were really significant in the notion of the digital and in the notion of the periodical, but which perhaps now seem a little bit old hat. And that is kind of quantification, numbers, and the way in which that's a kind of significant component, I think, of the sorts of Victorian antecedents that you're looking at. And then the connection of quantification with democratization, because it would seem to me that part of the history that you're looking at, certainly the disciplinary history you're looking at, is bound up in that notion of the periodical as something which expands the social and cultural range of Victorian studies.
Thank you very much for those questions. And again, for a limited time, you can get 20% off now on the hardback or paperback editions book. Anywho, yes, you're absolutely right that periodicals have only ever existed as in numbers. And in a chapter on Henry James, though it's not, it's more about kind of arguments about literary studies and methods, does suggest that quantitative approaches are in some ways licensed not just by scale, but to an idea about the quanta, right, of text, that it is countable, and that absolutely, like, periodicals are not just a number of scale, but of quantization. Anyway, in the sense that you are pointing out, what also makes them really interesting to study in a variety of ways. And I don't think we've really even begun to fully explore those possibilities. One project that I'm not sure matured, but that I still think about a lot is Matthew Philpott's tried to make a fractal measurement of periodical issues, and just as a different way of counting their elements or their continuance over time, which I think is just a really creative way of meeting the quanta or the countability of periodical numbers, using kind of contemporary concepts and methods. Your other point about democratization, I think, is also interesting, and it's beyond the scope of the book, which does attend more to what's happening in the academy, right? And I made that choice on purpose. But there's a lot of work out there that tries to talk about the internet as this as another version of kind of Victorian forms, like the Victorian internet of the telegraph, etc. That does change our relationship to each other and to civics. The argument in chapter 2 about privacy may come nearest to this consideration, is that what happens when we become subjects in a network. One thing that has been hypothesized is that, well, the more we connect, the better things get. This is what Mark Zuckerberg has always promised us about his platforms. This notion of this kind of what's been called neo-cosmopolitanism. The more connections you have, the flatter rather than hierarchical we organize ourselves, the more democracy will flourish, the more freedoms and more empathy, etc. When in fact those platforms have produced their opposite, which we're seeing in real time with the surveillance and threatened deportation of so many students in my country. So I talk in chapter 2 about how George Eliot is a really useful figure for thinking about both sides of that coin. Someone who has been credited with in really promoting the possibilities of sympathetic understanding through connections, and yet highly aware at the same time of the darker potentials for surveillance in those very networks. Yeah, Bethany, I found that essay on networks crucial because of how Galloway cites the definition of a network is something that connects, but it's also a trap. And that's, I think, a very useful model for thinking about this.
As someone else who also thinks about the past and the present, I work on the 18th century more, so it's even more fun to be like, did you know social media existed in the past too? People are like, what? And you're like, let me tell you about pamphlet culture and slow form Reddit. People making up funny names to burn their enemies. Like, come on. Which is different. But yeah, I think it's a really great piece. So so fun. Yeah, it's slow form Reddit. That's what it is. I mean, anyway. Come to other fun things about the pre-Victorian periods. That's
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
I
that's
love the slow form Reddit, by the way. That's I'm going to use that. Thank you. I'll cite you, Kathy.
And I'll just say, like, that's one of the risks of anachronism that in the introduction I try to address, is that, oh, look, everything starts in my period. Well, you see that argument happening, across literary periods, and that's not the argument I'm really trying to make. Right? Is that that we can use anachronism to tell a story, but it's not the only or exclusive story, which is why I find strategic presentism really useful, because it acknowledges that this is a construction, right? A construction I'm using for certain argumentative purposes, and that there is also such interesting work in other prehistories and genealogies. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I think we're also all very used to the notion of a receding horizon in periodical studies, and especially in poetry. Just a shout out to Tennyson's Ulysses there, because I always like to fit in a poetry reference in Digi events, so forgive me. But I want to round off by thanking everybody for an absolutely fabulous conversation, and most especially to Paul for his wonderful introduction of his book. I've read it in proofs, and I heartily recommend that you should all rush out and buy it. Thank you, Paul. It's a terrific achievement. Congratulations again on your promotion. We're all really delighted for you. I want to signal that there's another Digi event next month. It's a special one. It's the Colby Lecture, which usually happens at our conference, but this time it's a Digi event on the 9th of May, Friday the 9th of May, 8 a.m. Pacific, when W. Hamish Fraser is introducing his wonderful book, The Edinburgh History of Scottish Newspapers, 1850 to 1950. And I hope you can join us then. There's a link in the RSVP newsletter, and I think also coming on the website soon. Thank you, everybody. Much appreciated. Hope to see you next month. Take care. Thanks again, Paul.
Bye.
Thank you.